Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us. My name is Glenn Scheyd. I'm chair of the Department of Psychology and Neuroscience at Nova Southeastern University, and I'm an evolutionary psychologist by training. And what I want to talk to you about today is happiness and sort of the challenge of happiness in light of evolutionary psychology and evolutionary theory and the genetic predispositions that we all have as humans. So thank you again for joining us. And let me share my screen here. I can just jump right into PowerPoint, and that's what I'm looking for. Okay, so I've got a window popping up on my screen that I need to close here, and then I can get it. Okay. All right, Carlos, can you confirm for me if you are seeing the PowerPoint slides correctly at this point, or if I need to
You want to
modify something?
go ahead and hit from beginning so you could start your.
Okay, there we are. Does it look right?
Perfect.
Okay, so as you can see, title of the talk, Unsatisfied by Design. This is by design of the process of natural selection over the course of human evolutionary history. Happiness, evolution, and human nature. And I'd like to start very briefly with a little bit of a thought experiment to get you in the mind of the topic and sort of perspective that I'm going to be approaching it from. And what I want you to imagine is what seems like sort of idyllic existence, a world where nobody experiences pain, sadness, hunger, fear, suffering, really discomfort of any kind. And I think at first blush, that seems like basically a perfect world, a utopia, if you will. But what I want to suggest is that if you remove any one of these things, in particular, that you get negative consequences that you might not anticipate. It's just sort of a monkey's paw phenomenon where you make one wish, not realize what the downstream consequences are. So let's just take physical pain, for instance. It's sort of a very unpleasant part of existence, but it's a necessary one and serves an important purpose. And we can see this if you take a look at any of the case studies of people who suffer from the condition known as congenital analgesia. That is, they're born with the inability to experience physical pain. So they can tell differences in pressure, they can tell differences in temperature, but they don't subjectively experience pain in the way that you do. If you have a broken bone or just fall down, scrape your knee or stub your toe, they don't experience pain at all. Which again might seem like, well, that would be perfect. I hate pain. Why would anybody want that? But what you see in these cases is that people rarely live beyond the age of about 25, generally because they're missing some important information or some important signal from their body alerting them to the fact that something is going wrong, that there's disease, that there's injury that needs to be attended to, or it's going to get much worse and eventually could become fatal, and generally does, unfortunately. And that's basically the perspective on all of these forms of discomfort. The same can be applied to nausea, the same can be applied to sadness, and basically any of the subjective negative experiences that people go through emotionally and physically are there because they're serving some evolutionary purpose, and people who didn't experience them wouldn't have survived over evolutionary time. And so the perspective of evolutionary psychology, it's a functionalist perspective, an adaptationist perspective, and I presume that most of the audience is at least broadly familiar with theory of evolution by natural selection, but I'd like to sort of run over some of the key points here before we get into the specifics of today's topic. So the general mechanism of natural selection is you have competition among members of a species, and they have variation in the particular genes that they have and in the traits that arise from those genetic influences. And some of those combinations are going to be more effective at navigating the environment than others. And navigating the environment, that includes finding food, that includes forming friendships and alliances, finding mates, rearing offspring, and all of the things that we need to do in order to succeed in propagating our genes as individuals. And so whoever essentially has the best traits for carrying out that entire catalog of behaviors ends up being favored over evolutionary time. And so those of us who are here today are the products of millions of years of descent with modification that has left us predisposed to behave in ways that were beneficial for our ancestors, and that in fact are the only reason that we still exist today as individuals, as opposed to the descendants of those people who didn't survive. Inclusive fitness is an important concept, probably the most important update to theory of evolution by natural selection since Darwin's time. It was introduced in 1964 by a mathematical biologist named W.D. Hamilton, and it just expands it from the traditional view, which is individual selection, where one organism is competing against another organism, usually a member of its same species, to shifting it down to looking at the effects at the genetic level. So it's not just that evolution is going to favor organisms that behave in ways that are beneficial to themselves and their own survival, but really that are going to behave in ways that are beneficial to all of their genes. So if you are able to help out your brothers and sisters, contributing to their efforts to raise your nieces and nephews, if you're able to help your own offspring, other family members, the more closely related they are to you, the more shared genes you have with those people. And so if you're disposed to behave in ways that assist them, your genes are vicariously through you helping out themselves and helping other copies of your genes to survive to the next generation. Psychological adaptations are no different from any other adaptations. We have an opposable thumb because it's beneficial to be able to grasp things and throw things. We have a vertebrate stance so that we can see greater distances, and that helps to alert us to looming predators and it frees up our hands so that we can use those opposable thumbs. So those are useful morphological adaptations, and psychological adaptations function in the same way. The ability to recognize and catalog hundreds of different human faces is something that we're all, with very few exceptions, something that we're all capable of doing more or less automatically. Computationally, it's extremely complex, but we have an evolved adaptation. So the psychological software essentially is there to begin with when we're conceived and develops very quickly over childhood and into adulthood. So that everybody's very good at that particular psychological adaptation. The way that any adaptation works, including these psychological adaptations, is that there is some challenge posed by the environment over evolutionary time, and the various genes that dispose different behaviors to try to deal with that are selected among by evolution so that only the effective solutions remain over time. They get honed with each generation. So that is where an evolved adaptation ends up coming from. It's particularly well suited. It has been honed very finely to carry out one particular function by the process of natural selection. So by analogy, you can think of a screwdriver, and maybe there are different things you can do with a screwdriver. You could pry something open with it, or you could try to use it as a hammer, but it's extremely well designed by humans in this case to carry out one particular function, to drive screws into a piece of wood or into a wall. And our psychological adaptations are the same way. They function to solve one particular adaptive challenge that we would have had ancestrally. They may be co-opted into other purposes in a modern environment, but they're designed to do one particular thing by natural selection. And it's an interactionist model that evolutionary psychologists work with. I think it's just sort of a trivial claim at this point to say that it's always both nature and nurture, but that's really just a starting point, and then you have to explore, well, what do you mean by that in your specific model or perspective? And in evolutionary psychology, the nature part is the genetic predisposition that we have to behave in particular ways that would have served our ancestors, and the environment or the nurture input is the particular activating stimulus in the environment that causes that that adaptation to be activated, to come online. So we have evidence that there is an evolved human adaptation for jealousy within romantic relationships. So people who are in long-term committed monogamous relationships don't like when their partner is flirting with somebody else, and that activates this particular emotional state, jealousy, and motivates us to do things to try to prevent the relationship from being harmed. And just to take another example, everybody has an evolved adaptation that is the ability to form calluses on the bottom of your feet, or the bottom of your feet, or on your hands. The adaptation is there, but if you never encounter the friction that causes that adaptation to be activated, then you can go through your entire life wearing velvet gloves and slippers and never develop calluses. Likewise, if you're not in a committed relationship with anybody, you may never experience jealousy. The adaptation is still there, though. Okay, so I want to look at emotions now, which will bring us toward the topic of the day. And these stimuli depict the so-called basic emotions. This is an area of research that's been popularized in recent times by Paul Ekman. And what the basic emotions have in common is they're human universals. So these are not particular to any one country, any one ethnic group, any one subculture, but humans everywhere experience the same subjective sensations or qualia, to use the technical term. It feels the same to be happy here in South Florida as it does for somebody to be happy in Indonesia or in the Aleutian Islands or in Peru or Australia, anywhere you may be. For happiness, sadness, disgust, anger, surprise. And did I miss one of them? Anger, let's see, happiness, surprise, fear. Here's the other one. Happiness, sadness, fear, surprise, anger, and disgust are the 6 basic emotions. And each one of them has an associated facial expression that can also be recognized cross-culturally anywhere in the world. I say Paul Ekman popularized this research, which he did in social psychology, but it was really pioneered by Charles Darwin more than 100 years prior to this in his book, Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals. And he was really the first to expound on this idea that there are distinct adaptations that are emotional states that serve some functional purpose to keep us alive, and to he wasn't familiar with genetics at the time, but with whatever mechanism was responsible for evolution, which wasn't understood quite in Darwin's day, that the distinct emotional states that we have would have served that purpose, right? So that applies to happiness and sadness. It applies to all the other basic emotions as well. So I have a little chart here, and we can just sort of run down quickly what those functions would have been. So fear, again, like these pain and depression, so forth that I talked about at the beginning, it's unpleasant, but it's specifically because it's unpleasant that it's able to serve that adaptive purpose. In the case of fear, it allows us to avoid injury. You can imagine in an ancestral environment, your own ancestors seeing a snake slithering across the ground would have shied away from that. But there may have been others who were less fearful of snakes. There may even have been some who were drawn to snakes and thought, oh, how cute, let me go and try to pet that. And if it's a venomous viper, then they die and in turn don't pass down their genes. It's one of the problems of dying is you no longer have opportunities to reproduce, and really that's the main problem of dying from an evolutionary perspective. So fear serves that purpose. We have widespread fears around the world, sometimes at a level that's paralyzing, and that's a phobia. But even if you don't have a clinical phobia of snakes, of heights, of spiders, and so forth, most people are wary of these things. More wary of them than they are of, say, automobiles and downed power lines and things that are actually a lot more dangerous to us in a modern environment, but evolution has not had time to shape a fear of. Anger can serve the purpose of allowing us to maintain our status, our territory, our resources. Basically allows us to show our rivals that we're serious and we will not allow them to come in and grab things that are rightfully ours, and most displays of anger generally serving some purpose of that sort. Disgust is it functions for prophylaxis, that is for disease prevention. So if you bite into something that you thought was a fresh piece of fruit, and then you taste that it's rotten, you're immediately inclined to spit it out. Not only that, but the distinct facial expression that goes with it is this thing where your teeth are actually scraping food off of your tongue to cut down that much more on the risk of being poisoned by consuming some spoiled food. Nausea serves the same purpose if you do happen to swallow some of it. Then regurgitation keeps you safe, unpleasant as it is. It's better than keeping that stuff still in your body. Surprise is an important one. It's not as immediately obvious maybe what the function of that would be adaptively, but it serves to direct our attention toward new stimuli, because in some cases those new stimuli are going to be very important things. It could be a predator lurking in the environment, or it could be another human with an angry facial expression. You don't want to miss that and be caught off guard in case there's going to be physical confrontation. It could be a potential mate that's of interest, and you don't want to miss those opportunities. So if you attend to new things in the environment, and it's surprise that allows us to do that, then you're going to be better off in the long run. And now the key ones that I want to focus on today, happiness and sadness. So what would have activated happiness in ancestral environments is if you accomplish something of which you could be very proud, accomplished it through your intelligence and hard work and dedication, and other people in your community had seen this, and then your esteem in their eyes rose because of this, as you get the boost in status, and a boost in status is associated with expanded opportunities for forming alliances and friendships, and also makes you more attractive to potential mates in the population. And it's not immediately obvious why that would have been beneficial. Everything has to ultimately get filtered through genetic success. So the more potential mates you have, the better opportunity you'll have to pass your genes along. And so if you accomplished something of this nature and everybody was cheering you on and then cheering at your success, then you should be rightfully proud and happy. And that's what the experience of happiness is designed to do from an evolutionary perspective. Sadness, on the other hand, is sort of the inverse of that. If you did something where you made a bad choice, you made a terrible mistake, and there's a disastrous consequence because of that, you've inadvertently harmed one of your friends or family members or yourself, and you may be in a similar situation in the future, you don't want to make that same mistake again. And so the more intense those negative feelings are, all the way to and including rumination and clinical depression, the more effective that's going to be at making sure you don't make that exact same mistake again in the future. And so it serves to shape our behavior. So this is where evolutionary psychology sort of lines up with behaviorism. Happiness and sadness are associated with reinforcement and punishment, basically. So what is the purpose of an organism? I think this little comic captures it fairly well. And the amusing fact is just that we're the first ones who have this additional adaptation that leads us to philosophical reflection on what the whole function of our existence is, or what the purpose of our existence is. But basically we're designed to carry out a whole series of different behaviors that work in the service of our genes. Sometimes they work to our subjective benefit and they make us happy. Sometimes they don't. But in either case, what we are motivated to do, what we desire, and so forth, is primarily just influenced by these genetic predispositions that we have. And so some have suggested that really the best way to think about it is not that, here we are, we're in charge, somewhere inside our brain, we have a little man riding around in our head and controlling things the way that we tell him to, but that the signals that we're given and that motivate our behaviors are coming to us from the genes, and the genes are sort of running the show, and they're just using us to carry out their functions. And you can see clearly that other animals are doing this. They aren't reflecting on what they're doing. They're just behaving in ways that are good for their genes. So humans are a little bit different, but we're descendants of other animal species, and basically we've been shaped by evolution by the exact same forces of natural selection and sexual selection. So I'll get back to that in a couple of minutes, but I want to talk about a little bit of the research from the field of positive psychology. It's not my own field, so I don't want to go too far into the weeds here. but just a handful of important findings from the field of positive psychology, just practical advice, and indications of what are the things that genuinely make people happy, or generally make people happy, I guess both of those. So having serious positive relationships, a sense of belongingness within your family, a sense of belongingness in your community, whatever community that may be, it might just be your neighborhood, or it might be that there's some hobby that you're dedicated to and you have a circle of friends that you interact with and have that shared interest with. And what the research generally shows there in terms of the importance of positive relationships is you get most of the benefit just by having like one really close friend and confidant, someone that you can rely upon, someone that you can trust, and that you can share things with. But at that point, it doesn't make a huge difference if you have one close friend or 15 close friends. As long as you have one really close, genuine friend that you can rely upon no matter how bad your situation gets, that takes care of most of the effort, or takes care of most of the difference between someone who is miserable because they have 0 friends and someone who's happy and has a dozen very close friends like that, as long as you have at least one. Surmounting challenges is what bestows happiness. So this should sound like the example that I gave of somebody in an ancestral environment where they accomplished something in full view of their tribe, and everybody passed on accolades because of that. If you dedicate yourself to something that's genuinely difficult and to doing the hard work of actually accomplishing that over long term, then when you do finally accomplish it, there's a great sense of relief, satisfaction. There is, in fact, happiness when you've accomplished that. The problem is that in basically 100% of these circumstances, there is inevitably going to be some trade-off between short-term and long-term satisfaction, or short-term and long-term enjoyment. And anyone who has ever procrastinated on any assignment or task at their job that they did not want to do can surely relate to that. The idea is basically, if you want to write a book and that's your goal, you have to just sit down every day and bang out a few pages. And if you do that over the course of 100 days or over the course of a year, you're gonna have a book ready at the end of that. But on any particular day, when it's time to do that, you also have the option of going to the freezer and getting out a pint of Ben & Jerry's and plopping down on the couch and binge watching something on Netflix. And that's going to be a lot more pleasurable in the short term. And so you always have to delay gratification in order to have this sort of long-term satisfaction of accomplishing a genuinely rewarding goal. Experiencing unexpected good news makes people genuinely happy. So if you receive a compliment, but it's the same compliment you've gotten a million times in your life, it doesn't do much to boost your ego. But if you are the most beautiful person in your town, and then you get a compliment about how intelligent you are, particularly if it's specific, and the person is pointing out the way that you solved this particular problem, that was very clever, I'm glad you thought of that, then that's sort of an unexpected compliment, and that helps people feel better a lot more than just one other person walking up to a genius and saying, wow, you're so smart, or walking up to someone who's just gorgeous and saying, you're so good looking. They've already been told this. And it's not that they want to stop being brilliant or good looking. It's just that it no longer is rewarding to be told that by one more person, but just any unexpected good news. So if you happen to get a bonus check or something that you weren't expecting to get, that's great. You get a little bit of a hit from that in terms of the dopamine, and you get to feel happy while you're experiencing that. One of the most prominent positive psychologists, Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, is famous for is his work on flow. And so this is if you're engaged in some creative endeavor, and you see this even with people who have ADHD, where the stereotype is they're always jumping from one thing to another. But if they find something that's genuinely engaging, and maybe that's just solving some particularly complex video game, or maybe it's that they have an interest in mathematics and they're trying to prove some theorem, and that's what's genuinely engaging for them. They can spend hours just focused on that one task and sort of lose track of time, forget to have a meal and forget whatever else they had going on. And we feel genuinely happy and excited while we're engaged in this flow state. But we're engaged in it to such an extent that it doesn't even occur to us really that we're happy in the moment. But it's a very pleasant experience to be engaged deeply in something like that, some creative endeavor. And then charity, just as sort of practical bit of advice. It's an old adage that it's better to give than to receive. But you could be arguing that just in terms of the morality of things, it's better to be helping out others than it is to be demanding that they help you out if you're in a position to do either of them. But empirically, sharing with others and donating to causes that you care about and giving away things to people who are genuinely going to benefit from what you're sharing with them, that actually does make people happier. So even just from a selfish perspective, you're better off buying a gift for somebody else than you are buying something for yourself, even if it seems like, I really want this thing. Why should I spend my money on somebody else if I want to do the selfish thing and just make myself feel better? But empirically, it works out better to give than to receive. And then we can examine all of these from another level as well, just in terms of the underlying neurochemistry. When any of these things listed above make us happy, it's because of what's going on in the synapses, with dopamine and serotonin in particular as the primary neurotransmitters associated with feelings of happiness. So it's dopamine that's responsible for the feeling of gratification that you get after you've had a long craving for something. That works in more mundane circumstances as well as with addicts. If they've been playing a slot machine and the last 20 times they haven't gotten anything, and then they get a reward on the 21st time, there's a little hit of dopamine, and that's what makes it an addictive behavior. That's what makes it come back and repeat the same behavior that really may be detrimental to us in the long run. When you log into social media, if you're active on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and for people who are, they generally check first thing in the morning. And the only question is, do you check before you go to the toilet, or right after you go to the toilet, or when you're on the toilet? And if you check and you see you have 6 new alerts, that's very exciting. And the excitement there is underlaid by the rush of dopamine. If you check and you have no new notifications, then that's going to be very disappointing, and you'll come back and check again the same way someone pulls the arm on the slot machine again. I don't know if the arms are really functional anymore these days, but a traditional slot machine, let's say. And serotonin is the neurotransmitter that's really associated with higher feelings of subjective well-being. So just, I'm in a good mood today, I'm in a bad mood today. You can basically predict how a person's going to respond if you know how much serotonin is floating around in their synaptic gaps on that particular day. And this is how antidepressants generally work. It's by getting more serotonin out, or by keeping more serotonin out in some cases, as in the case of Prozac. It takes a while for it to build up, but it's just preventing the serotonin from being vacuumed back up into the neurons after it's released into the synapses. So dopamine and serotonin ultimately underlie these feelings of happiness. So I want to introduce the concept of the EEA now. That's from evolutionary psychology. It stands for Environment of Evolutionary Adaptiveness. And it refers to sort of the sum total of all the periods of history over the course of our evolution as a species, and the environmental forces that ended up shaping us into beings that have the genetic predispositions that we do have, and now sometimes out of place in a modern environment. So the human populations, and you can get this from the archaeological record, but you can also get it from the last couple hundred years of anthropological data. If you look at the remaining hunter-gatherer populations in the world today, they seem to map on to what would have been the experience of most humans throughout most of our history as a species. So if you go back 50,000 years, for instance, or 100,000 years, we were living in the Pleistocene on the African savanna in hunter-gatherer bands of, on the order of maybe 200 people or so, sometimes a little smaller, sometimes a little bit larger, but not too much larger. They didn't have large towns. They certainly didn't have large cities. So human populations were different. You had a couple hundred people that you knew, and all of you knew each other extremely well. These were basically the only people you would see for most of your life. And so that's very different from the modern urban experience that most of us are living today. Daily routines, well, there wasn't a lot to do in terms of like going to school and going to work, but you do have certain things that had to be done every day. So you don't get long vacations from going out and doing the actual hunting and gathering that will sustain you and your family members and other members of your tribe that you're sharing your food with. The technology that was available to us, we've been cooking with fire for a very long time, so we consider that a technology, and having simple stone tools to allow us to do some of the hunting and gathering, and also building structures for shelter and so forth. So that technology was available to us, but it was technology that you grew up around and you understood it by a pretty young age, in contrast to the technology that we rely on today. Material resources, there weren't really any rich people in ancestral environments. There were people who happened to get a larger slab of meat on that particular day, but you can't keep a slab of meat and accumulate it as wealth and build up a stockpile of it for years and years. It'll just start rotting if people don't eat it within a couple of days. And so there really wasn't accumulation of wealth. So there wasn't wealth at all in the first place, which is sort of a negative thing in most regards. But if you don't have wealth at all, then you also don't have inequitable distribution of wealth and the perception that some people are unfairly garnering far more of a share of the pie than others. So if you contrast the experience of people living in hunter-gatherer tribes, which is what most of our ancestors did throughout our history as a species, contrast that with life in the present day, you see differences in all of these regards. And what I want to bring up here now, without going into detail on any particular one of these charts, is something that's been reported by Steven Pinker in his recent book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, which is just that it's unquestionably the case that in most regards, human life has gotten better over the years. And this is just in relatively recent history, but it's all more so the case if you go back over 100,000 years or more than if you just go back over a couple hundred years. Literacy has improved dramatically, vaccination has improved dramatically, childhood mortality, also risk of dying in childbirth. These have dropped dramatically compared to what they were for most of our history. People living in extreme poverty, the number of people who genuinely are at risk of starving to death has dropped dramatically in relatively recent history. And so objectively, the world has become a much better place. And we should, if you sort of step back and view it from an outsider, it seems like people today should be much happier than people 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago, in terms of the comforts that we have. Because even people living below the poverty line today, in most cases, have a much more comfortable existence than King Henry VIII or Genghis Khan or any other world leaders from history who lived more than a couple hundred years ago, in the sense that we have air conditioning and we can get around much greater distances with automobiles. We have more reliable shelters. We have medicine that's more likely to help us than kill us. And in so many regards, it's just a much better existence today, even in dark times such as these. But we're not really designed to reflect on how much worse things could be and feel happy about it. We are instead designed to reflect on how things could be better, because that's what motivates us to make things better. So I'm going to go through some of these paradoxes here. So first of all, in terms of community and connections, on the one hand, we are now potentially connected to many thousands of different people and live in cities with far greater population density than what you would have found anywhere during the Pleistocene. But on the other hand, the relationships that we have tend to be more shallow, and so less inclined to actually make us feel happy, make us feel satisfied with those relationships with our friends and other members of our community. In terms of potential mates, if you imagine growing up in a community where there are only 200 people you're going to know your whole life, and a sizable chunk of those are very close relatives, and so you're not interested in them, and then you're, let's say, only interested in males or females, then that cuts it further in half. And in order for you to be interested in them potentially, and for them to be interested in you potentially at the same time, so that it is a viable potential mate. You have to be within certain age range of that person, and it can't be the person who's just been dating your best friend and so forth. So you're down to maybe a couple dozen people that you could potentially form a romantic and sexual relationship with in your life. And these days, you could have literally thousands of times as many potential mates out there if you joined up for different dating apps and so forth. But we aren't happier with the choices that we have, even though we have maybe 1,000 times as many mates to choose from. You'd think that would make us much happier, but there's research just in general on what is the effect of giving people more choices on their happiness in the situation. You look at with like different salad dressings and so forth that are available at a grocery store, and there may be 100 or more available, but it doesn't really make people happier if you have more than about half a dozen of them. When you start adding more, then they just feel stressed out. They're going to be making the wrong choice, or they're not going to be picking the best one. Whereas if there are only 24 people to choose from, let's say, it's easier to figure out who's the best one and then hope that relationship works out. If it doesn't, then you figure out, okay, maybe this is the best one. Give that a try. But if you have thousands of potential mates, you don't feel happier, even though clearly you have a much greater chance of finding someone that you would genuinely have a lot in common with and genuinely find very attractive. It doesn't lead to greater satisfaction. That relates to reproductive choices. Throughout 99.99% of human evolutionary history, there was just variation in terms of how many children people wanted to have, as there still is today. So I guess I should say 100%, but what has changed recently is just our power to influence that outcome, really, because what we all inherited, because otherwise we wouldn't exist if our ancestors didn't have this tendency, is just sexual desire and libido and attraction to certain people and desire to be with those people. And that's regardless of how many offspring you wanted to have. You may have wanted to have 8 kids, you may have wanted to have 0 kids. But what happened for people who wanted to have 8 kids in ancestral environments is they found a relationship, they found someone attractive, they had sex with that person, and they had kids. And for those people who didn't want to have any children, they found certain people attractive, they had sex with those people, and then whoops, they had kids that they didn't want to have. And so what's changed in recent times is now we have an opportunity to select this thing that has a tremendous impact on how our life plays out, which is, do you want to have 3 kids? Do you want to have 0 kids? Do you want to have 5 kids, 1 kid? And for the most part, people get to choose exactly how many children they want to have. That should make us very happy, given how important and impactful that decision is. But again, it doesn't. It's an interesting sort of fact that what enables us to do this is just that we've developed reliable birth control because we have intelligence. We have intelligence because of evolution, and what evolution favored intelligence to do was solve problems that would lead us to reproduce more ultimately. So we sort of short-circuited the system that gave rise to the intelligence in the first place. In terms of the work week, you may assume, like, if you're just struggling from day to day to make sure you get enough food to survive, that's occupying like most of your waking hours. But if you actually look at hunter-gatherer populations, if you look at the Yanomamo, if you look at the Ache, the Machigenga, and these other populations that are still around today, what you see is that they generally spend about 3 or 4 hours a day gathering food, typically. And then the rest of the day is leisure time. They're hanging out with their friends, they're telling stories, they're dancing, they're having a good time for most of their waking hours. And it's a bit ironic that with all of the technologies that we've developed to have machines and artificial intelligence in some cases do most of the work for us that would have had to have been done by hand in ancestral environments. What we've done is not say, that's fantastic, now we don't have to go to work anymore, we can just relax, we can have fun, we can engage in artistic endeavors and just enjoy ourselves for as long as we live. But instead, no, we've created these societies where we're actually working far more than what we would have had to do if we'd been born 50,000 years earlier. So that's unfortunate that it worked out that way. I don't know how to change that system, but Bertrand Russell wrote a book, In Praise of Idleness, where he pointed this out about 100 years ago, before he even knew about all the anthropological data. that just sort of confirmed his impression there. So we work harder. If you're in the United States, you may be working 50 hours a week. If you're in Italy, you may be working 30 hours a week, but you're doing more work. Forget commuting, just the work time itself is probably greater than it would have been for our ancestors tens of thousands of years ago. Food availability. So this we no longer have to worry about nearly as much as our ancestors did. They had to worry about starvation. That was an ever-present threat, or a looming threat throughout human evolutionary history. Are we going to be able to get enough food so that we survive to the next day to go out and look for enough food again? And so it is sort of a hard scrabble existence. And we now, most of us at least, live in modern environments where there's so much food available that not only do we no longer have to worry about starvation, but we actually have to worry about the problems caused by having too much food. So we have to worry about type 2 diabetes, you have to worry about hypertension, ultimately you have to worry about heart attacks, and mobility problems caused by obesity, and a whole suite of problems that arise from the fact that evolution was very careful to make sure that we could survive a famine, that we would be very hungry basically all of the time, looking for more calories, particularly looking for foods that are high in fat and high in sugar, and that ends up being detrimental to us in a modern environment. Our standard of living, again, objectively, it's improved tremendously. Just the fact that almost all of us have air conditioning, have indoor plumbing, have clean water, have effective medicine available to us when we need it. These have dramatically improved the human condition. So we are much better off, and it seems like we should be happy, but again, that's not the way we're designed. We're not designed to be complacent or to reflect on what's gone well. The way that we're designed leads us to something that's called the Hedonic Treadmill. The term itself was introduced by Brickman and Campbell in a 1971 paper, but the concept has been around for much longer. St. Augustine, for instance, wrote about it, and the idea is basically that cravings don't go away, except for momentarily. And once one craving is satisfied, we're on the move looking for what's the next thing we need or what's the next thing we want to have. And we sometimes convince ourselves if we get this one next thing, then we'll be happy. Then we can rest on our laurels and say we've done well in our life. But satisfaction, even accomplishing very, very difficult things like getting a book published, for instance, tends to be ephemeral. If you have just earned a degree, it could be bachelor's degree, master's degree, doctorate, whatever, you've put a lot of work into that, and you may feel satisfied when you're finally done with it. Probably in most cases more satisfied when you finish turning in your last final exam than actually at a commencement ceremony. But that satisfaction doesn't last. You don't sit there for the next 20 years thinking, why I'm happy today? It's because I finished that degree and that was a lot of work. It's, you'll feel happy in the moment when it's happening, when you're being recognized for it. But then sort of what have I done for me lately is what's motivating us. And so happiness ends up being fleeting because of this, unfortunately. So we're not designed to be satisfied. We're designed to essentially operate on a treadmill where we're ever in pursuit of the thing that it feels like is going to really make us satisfied. But once you accomplish that, say, okay, I want to finish college. And once I do that, then I'll be happy. You finish college. You say, okay, well, now I need to get a job. So you get a job, you have an entry-level job, and you think, well, this one's okay, but what I really need is a promotion and a higher salary. And if that happens to work out for you and you get a promotion, you get a higher salary, you think, okay, this is fine. And you're happy on the day that you get that promotion and the first larger paycheck. But you have people who are literally earning 100 times as much money in their salary in the present day compared to what they got in their first job as a teenager. And they're still not thinking, now I have enough money that I'm really happy. So, does money lead to greater happiness? It doesn't hurt, but there's an asymptotic curve where if you have more than enough, then that's good. And if you have much more than that, it really doesn't make you much happier. It might make you a tiny bit happier to have $1 billion compared to $1 million. But really, if you just have enough that you're comfortable and you don't have to worry about your ability to survive and provide food for your family and so forth, that's all you need in order to avoid the misery of insufficient money. Okay, so I think I skipped a slide there. Okay, so what has evolution actually designed? In order to understand why we are the way we are today, it helps to reflect on this fact here that organisms who are perpetually motivated by cravings tended to replace those who were complacent. I mean, replace them over generations, over evolutionary time. So any individuals in the population who just thought, this is good, I have enough food, and I'm popular enough, not everybody in the community hates me, so I'm just gonna sit back and relax for the rest of my life. Those people were not as successful, their genes were not as successful as those of the people who were looking to improve things from what may have been an improved state relative to the day before, but could always get better. And unfortunately, in one sense, things can always get better, and we're very good at ferreting out what are the ways that things are going wrong and could be improved, and reflecting on those rather than reflecting on all that has gone well. And what we really have is a hedonic treadmill on top of a hedonic treadmill. So your own life could be getting better in many ways. You're progressing through this series of accomplishments, and that is overlaid over the historical fact that humans today have a much more comfortable existence than what we had ancestrally. And still, we tend not to be satisfied, at least in the long term. You're satisfied momentarily when a particular accomplishment is achieved, and then by design, you begin having a craving for something else. So we often, again, have these thoughts, if only I had whatever the next thing is that you want, then you feel like you'd be happy. If only I had a car, then I'd be happy. And you get a car, and it's great, you have a car now. But very quickly, the sheen wears off, and you no longer think this is so fantastic just to have a car. You want to have a better one, or you want to have a house, or you want to have a house that's in a better neighborhood, or you want to have the best house in your better neighborhood. Again, things can always be better, and the unfortunate flip side of that is we recognize that, and that's what is the source of a lot of, if not misery, at least dissatisfaction. And there's also a sort of a greater discrepancy between moments of happiness and moments of unhappiness, let's say, than we even recognize, because there's a difference between the experienced self and the remembered self. And if you actually ask people, in real time, how are you feeling today? And there are studies that do this, where they just text people, how happy are you right now, and so forth. And you compare that to people's recollections years later. They'll say, I was in pretty good mood back then. I was happy. Things were going well for me. And I didn't have this particular stressor that I'm worried about now. But actually, most of the time, most people are not happy, unfortunately. We go through our life unsatisfied most of the time. Again, because that's how we're designed to be by evolution. So it's sort of analogous to having a meal. You're very hungry. You think, okay, finally a meal, and you start eating it. And when you're in the process of eating it, it's very satisfying. But a couple of hours after you're done with that, you start to feel hungry again. It's a never-ending cycle. You're looking for what is the next meal you can have, and by extension, you're always looking for what is the next accomplishment that I can have that's this time really going to make me happy. But to get back to what I was talking about just a minute ago, with the experienced self versus the remembered self. If you ask people about like vacations that they've been on, and they're showing pictures that they took in front of the Grand Canyon or whatever, they talk about how wonderful an experience it was. If you actually are surveying people in the moment when they're doing this, they're like, I feel miserable, I'm hot, I'm sweaty, my legs are sore, I feel like I'm going to collapse here trying to climb the rest of the Bright Angel Trail back up to the rim. But years later, they'll reflect on the good moments, particularly the good moments that were captured on film, or not actual film, but digitally these days. And we tend to think that we were happier in retrospect than we actually were at the time. And maybe that's a good thing, or maybe that's a bad thing. But the fact of the matter is, most of the time, most people aren't happy, unfortunately. So knowing this actually allows us to sort of hack into the system. And again, I'm not a positive psychologist, so I can't expound at length about all of the things that we can do to make us much happier, but I will give some practical advice on the next slide about this. But just, what the fact of the matter is all organisms are endowed with a set of evolved adaptations. Humans are no different in this regard, but the way that we are different is that we understand that first point, that we are a product of natural selection, and that the tendencies that we have, the reason that we feel jealous or the reason that we're angry at somebody, or the reason that we feel discomfort when we're hungry, for instance, is because it serves some evolutionary purpose. And in some cases, that purpose is still in effect today. In other cases, it's not. So it doesn't make you any less hungry. It doesn't make you desire donuts any less. But it's still maybe helpful to recognize the fact that the reason you want to eat donuts all of the time, or at least if you're me, you want to eat donuts all of the time, is because if you'd had an opportunity to do that ancestrally, that would have been very good for you. That would have been the best thing you could do to avoid starving to death. And it's only because we're in this very different modern environment that that's no longer beneficial for us. The intelligence that allows us to recognize this also allows us to rebel against our nature and say, I'm not going to do something just because it's what my genes would want me to do. I'm the one in charge here. I'm going to make the decision. My genes want me to have a bunch of kids. I don't want to have a bunch of kids, so I'm going to choose not to. Or my genes want me to retaliate against this person who crossed me, but what does it matter? It's not all that important in the grand scheme of things, and so I'm just going to let it go. The interesting thing about fertility rates in particular, I think, is that well, as I already talked about, it's the intelligence that enables us to make the choice that counteracts the force of evolution that gave rise to intelligence in the first place. But the other thing is just that it only really works because the arrow of time is ever pointing forward. And if you flip things around so that getting to have sex was the reward for raising a child for 18 years, I think most people would probably choose to be celibate. I say that as a father of children that I haven't yet raised for 18 years, although I guess if you add up their ages, I'm already beyond that at this point. So in any case, recognizing that what motivates us is that we're inclined to behave in service of genetic predispositions because they were good for our ancestors allows us to sort of free ourselves of the shackles of that. And you can say, well, ancestrally, we ate meat, but I choose to be vegetarian, or ancestrally, there was this amount of violence, but I choose to avoid that, for instance. And then just bringing it to my final slide here, just in terms of some practical advice, a toolbox for subjective well-being, as I've titled it here. Understanding that function of desire, as I was just talking about, gives us more control over the situation than if we don't understand why do I want to do this thing. It doesn't make sense. It's bad for me if I keep doing this thing over and over again. Understanding the function of consumer goods as well. So recognizing how donuts, for instance, or pornography or social media have been designed to extract money from us in service of the people who are selling them, rather than serving our own good, gives us an important understanding of what's going on behind the curtain. Social media in particular, I don't think it even started out this way, but just sort of socially or culturally evolved so that what ended up being favored in Facebook and these other companies is just you get more ad revenue if the content is going to get people more engaged. And so that might seem like, oh, that's a good thing, right? We want people to be more engaged. They get the stuff that they want to see, and it's win-win for everybody. But it turns out that what engages people most, what they're most likely to click on, what they're most likely to respond to, are not things that make them really happy, but things that make them angry. And so really the more time you spend on social media, the more likely you are to be angry, whether that's from reading things that are shared by people who share your ideology or people who oppose your ideology that you think are all morons. It's just the anger fills the coffers of Facebook and other social media companies and doesn't necessarily do us any good. So what I would encourage you to do is just check out the data from positive psychology and look at what practical advice you can get from people like Marty Seligman and Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi in terms of additional details of what are actual practical things you can do to make yourself 5% or 10% happier, or make yourself happier on 10% more days than you otherwise would have been. They have a lot of good empirically supported advice in that regard. Stoic philosophy, I would recommend also. It might seem like it isn't Stoicism sort of the absence of emotions, and in a sense it is, but the way that it's important here is it's sort of an absence of dissatisfaction, or at least much less dissatisfaction. So what is encouraged by the Stoic philosophers is just recognizing, as you should, if you sit back and detail what happens every day of your life, just recognize that there are going to be frustrations, there are going to be impediments, there are going to be just unfortunate things that happen pretty much every day of your life. So you shouldn't be surprised when that happens. Just recognize, oh, yep, here we go again. And it's not a big deal. You've made it this far in spite of all those impediments. You're going to make it through this one just fine. And I think that is a worldview that tends to, if not make people more elated necessarily, at least makes them feel less unsatisfied. And then also along those same lines, there's research by Richard Davidson and Dan Goleman. They specifically studied Buddhist monks who were practicing mindfulness meditation, the practice known as Vipassana in Buddhism. But just the practice of mindfulness in general tends to reduce the amount of time that we go through life feeling miserable, feeling negative, feeling frustrated. It allows us to avoid what most people are doing most of their lives, which is sort of psychologically time traveling. They're ruminating on things that went bad for them in the past. They're looking forward to the one thing that's going to be genuinely satisfying in the future, rather than just appreciating consciousness as it happens in the moment. And then the important thing about that is really consciousness is the only thing that we experience. That includes pain, that includes happiness, that includes the thoughts that pop into our heads and so forth, but all of it is consciousness. And since that's all we have to work with, it's important to engage in these techniques such as mindfulness meditation that allow us to better take advantage of that. And I think I've gone on for quite long enough here. I really only have a few minutes left. So let me just open it up to questions, I guess, and then see what people want to know.
Okay, so there was one question. Somebody said, I'm curious if you can talk a little about how to put this information into practice. Knowing and understanding is one thing, but do you have any suggestions for practice?
Yeah, so that question may have come in as I was going over the information on the very last slide, but I guess I'd say mindfulness meditation, and then reading the Stoic philosophers. And then in terms of more specific advice, what can you do in a modern environment? Other than just my, don't spend so much time on social media bit of advice, I would say there's a lot of good practical advice, most of which I'm not all that familiar with myself, from the field of positive psychology. And so I would encourage people to check out the research from positive psychology for that answer.
Okay. And then this might be along the same lines, but could this trait be mitigated by practicing gratitude?
Yeah, I think it is. And I think you're more likely to see that happen in people who have engaged in the practice of mindfulness meditation, that they do tend to feel greater gratitude. I mean, we do, tend to just take for granted things when they go well and reflect much more on them when they go poorly. But just consciously making a decision to be grateful for things as they happen, and be grateful for what we do have and for those that we do have around us. Yes, that's something that will lead to greater subjective well-being, just in terms of your baseline day-to-day level of happiness.
Okay. And then I've got one last question. My life is very full, but I still don't feel satisfied. What are some things that I can do to be happier? Should I just quit my job and roam for food?
Well, unfortunately, we don't live in a time where it's necessarily practical to try to do that. There are some people who try to go off the grid, but I don't know if those people end up being happier for that decision. I think it may be the case that if you had been born 50,000 years earlier, you might have been less dissatisfied with the frustrations of your daily life. But we don't have the opportunity to do that. So we just sort of have to make the best of the culture that we're born into, and maybe at least locally try to change things to make it a little bit better for us and for the people that we care about. And apart from that, unfortunately, I don't have all the grand answers.